Welcome. We have a little bit of an expert today on the JFK files. Josh, you want to tell us about him?
Yeah, so this is Ken Jackson. He's joining us today. He's a former teacher from North Carolina, and as a North Carolinian myself, I think we can, Ken and I can agree we come from the better of the Carolinas.
I'm not going to get in trouble that way.
Catching strays today. I mean, I guess maybe we could start this thing off is kind of give us a little bit of background on how you got into the JFK files. How long have you been looking at them? How long have they been out? You're a little bit older than we are. And you were around for that time. Kind of walk us through there, how you came from.
Well, as I was telling you before the broadcast, I was in elementary school. I was in kindergarten when he got shot. I remember him being president, and I remember exactly where I was, when it happened. And, I didn't really think too much about it as a little kid growing up. But in 1975... when they actually released the Zapruder film, a lot of people don't realize that film showing him actually being shot was not aired to the public when it happened. It took 12 years for, I believe, Life magazine bought the rights to it for them to release it in 1975.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and it showed the whole sequence, from the very dramatic picture of him getting hit in the head. And then all of a sudden, there were always rumblings of conspiracy, but boy, when that was released, it just blew the lid off everything. Like, whoa, wait a minute here. Mm-hmm. And I guess ever since then, and I would have been a senior in high school then, is when I really, really started delving into this and getting interested in it. So that's kind of my background. And when I taught law and justice in North Carolina at the local high school up there, one of the things I said to my class is, you know what? We're going to get together, we're going to sift through evidence, and we're going to try to adjudicate the crime of the 20th century, which would have been the assassination of the 35th president. So we went through it. We, looked at films. We looked at written publications and, just our own personal gut feelings and went through it. And it was really quite interesting. And go ahead. I'm sorry.
So you had mentioned that you became interested in investigating this topic for yourself in high school. Mm-hmm. What piqued your interest? I mean, I get, you were in kindergarten when he was assassinated, so it's not quite the same, but what piqued your interest then? Like, what sort of got you to go, like, I'm going to investigate this topic specifically?
Well, again, when Life magazine released those pictures showing, an actual narrative or, photographic record that didn't comport with what the Warren Commission and all the official people in government were saying. It's like, well, wait a minute. These pictures just don't add up to what the bill of goods they've tried to sell us for the past 12 years.
Okay, so what was it about the pictures? Like, you recounted the story of you hearing about, you were in a grocery store when you heard JFK was assassinated.
Right.
What about those pictures specifically piqued your interest? Like, that made you think this doesn't add up?
Well, when they run the film, there's only about 7 seconds between the time JFK disappears behind the exit sign, where Mr. Zapruder is taking the movie, and then emerges, holding like this, like he's been, physically traumatized. There's only 7 seconds that elapse between that and when, his head is blown apart in the final shot. And for the amount of bullets they're saying and the amount of time, it really doesn't add up that well to the time that, if you believe Oswald acted alone, would have had to do all what he was supposed to have done. And, the number of bullets fired, they've, kind of backed themselves into a corner where they can only claim 3 bullets. The first bullet, having missed, hit the sidewalk and pieces of the sidewalk hitting a man and his son, and the man in the cheek. And I don't know if it hit the little boy or not, but I remember it hit the man in the cheek. So that bullet missed. The second bullet, the so-called magic bullet that went through Kennedy, came out, paused in midair, hit Connolly 2 or 3 times, and then, was pristine, was found on a stretcher. And then, of course, the third bullet that, just about blew JFK's head off. There's just too little time to account for those few bullets, and there's too much other damage that's shown. For example, there's a picture, and I don't know, did you look it up when I sent it to you? You can go online. I've got it in a book, but unfortunately the book I have is up at my summer residence. But it shows the windshield of JFK's car while it's at the hospital. There's a hole in the windshield, and if you look at the body styling of a 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible, the way the windshield is raked back, there's no way that hole could have been made from a trajectory 6 stories up into the rear. Similarly, there's a dent in the chrome header panel just above the rearview mirror where the convertible top would fasten down, and that dent doesn't comport with the trajectory from way up on high. There's just too many things happening in too little time with too few official bullets. Had Mr. Zapruder not been there taking that movie that delineates a definite timeline when everything would have had to have happened, they could have well gotten away with everything because, the photographic and film evidence just completely, negates any kind of wild stories because it either happened in that time frame or it didn't.
Mm-hmm. So I think we can all agree that the official narrative is a lie.
Yes.
As much as we can prove it.
Yeah.
So if that is the case, then what is your interpretation of that? Obviously, there's conspiracies floating around, anything from there were 3 shooters to his wife shot him, or the driver turned around and shot him.
Those are kind of bizarre, the wife and the driver thing. But I guess what you have to start with, the background of how JFK got elected president. A lot of people don't realize this, but you can, even though they were of different political parties, Kennedy being a Democrat, Trump and Reagan being Republicans, you can draw a lot of parallels to them. Kennedy was not at all liked by the establishment. He was young, he had different ideas. Even in the Senate, he did some things that the establishment didn't necessarily like. He and his brother Bobby went after the mafia during the Kefauver hearings and after Jimmy Hoffa. Well, the mafia and big unions were some big, donors to the Democratic Party of the day. In fact, you can even go on YouTube and see where some of the movers and shakers of the Democratic Party, like Harry Truman and Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was still active in party politics, where I grew up in upstate New York, was basically within 10 miles of where the Roosevelts lived. And they're both essentially saying on, when you pull up these YouTube things in person, saying, wait a minute, what's this young kid doing? It's not his turn yet. He needs to wait his turn. He doesn't know anything. And then you look at the way JFK ran for the presidency. Prior to 1960 in those days, candidates were largely chosen in the smoke-filled rooms of the conventions, and it was kind of like pay to play. JFK just completely subverted all that. Primaries weren't that big of a deal back then. I think there were like 20 or 21 of them. He entered them all, did an end run around the establishment, and won just about every, if not every, primary he entered, and entered the convention with the momentum of enough delegates to get elected on the first ballot and blow right past the establishment people. And they were not happy about that. Additionally, they tried to smear him. They took issue with that he was a Catholic. Oh, if he's elected, he'll take orders from the Pope. Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson, and a few others especially tried to smear him that way. And, he was like a rich playboy. Also, his father, who had ties to organized crime, having been a bootlegger in the 1920s, and also in bed with early Hollywood when they switched from silent to talking movies, and that was a big breeding ground for the mob, basically said to his son, I'll run and manage and finance your campaign from the behind the scenes. You go out there and campaign. Don't ask me any questions, and I won't tell you any lies. And he made deals with the Chicago mob. The Kennedy-Nixon election of 1960 was razor thin. And Sam Giancana and his cohorts up in Chicago delivered the city of Chicago, which in turn delivered Cook County, which in turn delivered Illinois, and that put JFK over the top electorally speaking. He also had to make a deal with the devil and get Lyndon Johnson against his better judgment to be his vice presidential candidate because he needed the conservative South Democrats, and they were a little bit disenchanted with JFK being a Northeasterner and a little bit in favor of civil rights. So he needed to kind of make a deal with the devil with LBJ. So I guess that's kind of his background. And like Trump, Kennedy was independently rich before he became president. In fact, like Trump, he worked for free. I believe he donated his entire salary to the Boy Scouts of America because he had been a Boy Scout. And he governed as he thought things should have been done, not as how the establishment wanted him to. In fact, he had a lot of fights with Congress and couldn't get a lot done legislatively speaking. And he basically, again, you can draw parallels to some extent to Reagan and to more extent to Trump. He thought outside the box, and it didn't sit well with a lot of people. And I think what you also have to realize and look at is with anything, it's like follow the money. Who had the most to gain with JFK out of the way? Okay, number one, the mafia did, because when Castro had revolted in Cuba and taken it over and switched it to a communist government, he kicked the mafia and all their lucrative casinos out of Cuba, and they wanted that back very badly. The CIA also had a dog in the fight because they had hoodwinked JFK about the Bay of Pigs and that it would succeed. And when JFK realized he'd been hoodwinked, he admitted personal responsibility, saying, okay, I might have been tricked, but I'm the responsible officer of government. In fact, he said, it's been said, victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan in his speech. And his popularity actually went up because, wow, here's a politician admitting and taking responsibility for his actions. And then additionally, he fired Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, who had crammed this down his throat when he was just naive and a new president. And surprise, surprise, Allen Dulles, after Kennedy is shot, is appointed by Lyndon Johnson to be one of the head people of the Warren Commission. So some elements in the CIA had something to gain. Lyndon Johnson had plenty to gain. A lot of people don't know this. Life magazine, just before the assassination, was in the midst of running a trilogy of articles about corruption in government. They had first run one in general about corruption. On November 8th, they had run one specifically about a man named Bobby Baker, who was a Johnson bagman against a corruption scandal involving vending machines in government buildings and kickbacks to Bobby Baker that ultimately were going to go to Lyndon Johnson. And actually, they were set to run the third article the week after the assassination, implicating Johnson himself. And Kennedy had even remarked to his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, excuse me, just before the trip, because she said, well, Mr. President, you're going to Dallas. How do you think things will go? And, you and Lyndon. And Kennedy looked at Mrs. Woods and said, Mrs. Lincoln, I keep saying Woods, and said, nah, Lyndon won't be on the ticket next year. In fact, he might be in prison. And so you had Lyndon Johnson having a lot to gain. There were all these entities that had a lot to gain. And I've talked quite a bit. Maybe you got some questions. I'm sorry.
Do you have anything specific?
I've got a lot. I mean,
fire away.
You definitely overflowing with information. I guess one quick one would be everybody had something to gain, essentially, is what you're saying here.
Yeah.
Everybody meaning essentially everybody, because he bucked the establishment, which is essentially what Trump is trying to do, loosely, off and on. Me and Josh kind of have some disagreements on with Trump. But I guess my question is, if everybody had something to gain, was everybody in on it? And if everybody was in on it, why was no one tipped off to it actually happening? Or did everybody just agree to let it happen?
I kind of think there's been some reports, and there's both pluses and minuses that it happened or not happened, but allegedly at the home of a rich oil tycoon named Clint Murchison, there was a meeting that happened the night before, and they called it the big event. And allegedly Murchison was there, obviously, because it was his home. A man named Billy Saul Estes, who also had been convicted in corruption scandals and served prison time in the 60s that involved LBJ. Some mafia people were recorded as being there, and possibly even LBJ himself. Although, to be honest with you, there's been some discrepancy about that aspect of it. But whether he was there or not, I kind of think, and the oil men had something to gain, because Kennedy was going to get rid of what was called the oil depletion allowance, because he was passing a massive tax revamping that lowered taxes for everyday Americans, but was also taking out some of this corporate welfare. My brother worked for Mobil Oil for many years, and he explained the oil depletion allowance to me. Basically, it's corporate welfare for oil companies where they could exempt 28% of their earnings from taxes. And Kennedy wanted to get rid of that. And it would have, had he done so in 1963 dollars, it would have cost the oil companies, I think, $300 million. And they were not happy about that. So I think maybe what might have happened was LBJ was kind of consulted. I don't know if he would have planned it ahead, although some people did. Kind of like, well, this event is going to happen and you can't stop it. Now you need to decide, you're being investigated. You might be indicted for corruption. For sure some of your underlings are going to be indicted for corruption. Do you want to be a Boy Scout and, blow the whistle on us and maybe serve federal prison time? Or would you rather that we call you Mr. President for the next 4 to 8 years, as long as you can sanitize this after it happens? We've already got a fall guy in place. And, so I think that's probably what may have happened. Again, I can almost without reservation say LBJ was somewhat complicit, but I'm not quite ready to accuse him to the degree of his complicity. Again, some people that I've read, like this book by Roger Stone, says that he outright helped orchestrate it. But I think at the very least, he played cleanup on aisle 7 to make it all go away and enhance his own benefit. A couple things, and again, I don't want to talk too much if you have questions or anything.
I guess one more question I have just to kind of finish this little piece of discussion off is, I believe I read one or two of the papers saying essentially that the Russians tried to tip off the CIA about something happening in Dallas that week.
Yeah. Actually, Nikita Khrushchev cried when he heard Kennedy had been shot. Because after the Cuban Missile Crisis, both leaders had breathed a sigh of collective relief. They had installed a hotline between Russia and the United States so that something like that couldn't get out of control again. And additionally, there were some back channel negotiations towards some détente and possibly even some cooperation in space exploration. And Khrushchev actually personally liked both JFK and Jacqueline, even though they disagreed from a policy point of view. And he was afraid the Russians would get blamed. And yes, I have heard, not in detail, but things about that. And Castro himself also thought, oh my gosh, we're going to get blamed for this. And he didn't really want it to happen because there'd been some back channel talks with Castro's regime too. And I might bring something else up if you want me to.
Please.
Vis-a-vis Vietnam, which became the pariah of the 1960s, as we all know. JFK had actually had 2 meetings with retired General Douglas MacArthur. And the second meeting, he invited him to the White House for what was supposed to be a half an hour. He found MacArthur so prescient and so engaging that he ruined and blew through his entire schedule for the day and kept MacArthur for nearly 4 hours discussing things with him. Essentially, during these meetings, MacArthur said, "Young man, you dodged a bullet with the Bay of Pigs. You admitted responsibility. You didn't pay a horrific political price. And you've acquitted the Cuban Missile Crisis hadn't happened yet. But you've got to remember a couple things relative to Vietnam. You were a frontline naval officer in the thick of things in the war with the Japanese. You know the Asian mentality of fighting, it vis-a-vis like kamikazes and suicide dashes and like that. They don't fight the same way we do. They don't place a high value on individual human life. And you've basically got to commit to an all-out total war if you're going to fight these folks like we did with Japan, or you've got to decide this is not worth doing. And really, in a nuclear age, is the domino theory even relevant anyway? And, MacArthur also pointed out the strength of our Navy is a deterrent. We don't want to get in a land war in Asia. And Kennedy pretty much took his advice. He issued Executive Memorandum number 263 in October of 63, saying that by the end of 65, all troops would be withdrawn from Vietnam. Advisors they were then. In fact, he started drawing them down. Interestingly, 2 or 4 days after Lyndon Johnson gets back to Washington after the assassination, on November 26th, he issues Executive Memorandum number 273, countermanding Kennedy's 263 and ramping up troops in Vietnam. And also, interestingly, the original draft of that memorandum was found to have been dated November 21st, 1963, while Kennedy was still alive. How did Lyndon Johnson know that he'd be able to issue an order like that while Kennedy was still alive? And again, who had to gain? The Johnsons, both Lyndon and Lady Bird, had big holdings in Bell Helicopter and in some of the aerospace and munitions companies that came out of Texas. Everything to gain and lots to lose.
Real quick before I throw it to Josh and let him take on us a couple of questions, we have one in the comments. So if anybody's watching that has any questions specific, send them through chat and we will get them. I guess the question is kind of referring back to a few minutes ago, we were talking about Cuba. Were the shooters those Cuban guys?
That I don't know. There is a man named Frank Files, and he actually had connections with the CIA and had connections with Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana, who were the mob bosses in Chicago. And Frank Files claims in an interview he did in 1993 and 1994 that he was the shooter behind the picket fence at the grassy knoll. And what he offers as evidence is the type of gun he uses, which is a 222, it's called, and I'm not that conversant with guns, which is like a pistol with a long barrel and a scope on it. And it had just been invented, I think, in 63, and it was not issued for public consumption. You know, the CIA, had dibs on it that early. And to prove his point, he talks about one of the shell casings that came out. He bit on it as, I don't know, some kind of stupid act of, like marking his territory or whatever.
Like a trophy.
Yeah, and that casing was found years later by a guy doing a dig behind the grassy knoll, and they went and dated it to the company, and it dated for 1963. So there's that guy who claims that he was, in with the mob, and he was also tied in with the CIA. Now, Oswald was also tied in with the CIA. He had, before he became an employee of the Texas School Book Depository, he had worked that summer of 63 in New Orleans. And he had been a very vocal advocate for a organization called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And he did a radio debate with someone who was for Cuba or against Cuba and against these things. And additionally, there's news television footage of him handing out leaflets and organizing a protest. In fact, he gets in a fight during one of the protests, gets arrested for disorderly conduct, gets bailed out by none other than Carlos Marcello, who's the head of the New Orleans Mafia. Coincidentally, Carlos Marcello's chauffeur is dating Oswald's mother. Then later on, at the police station, when Oswald is arrested and there's some impromptu news conferences, the sheriff says, well, we think Oswald he was aligned with the Cubans. He was in this organization called the Free Cuba Committee. Voice in the back of the room says, no, that's the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Camera pans around. It's none other than Jack Ruby. Well, if Jack Ruby had never met Oswald, how would he know the correct name of a club Oswald was associated with in New Orleans that previous summer? There's just all these things that smell like a 3-day-old fish, And then you have, let's look at the actual shooting. There's also a movie, and we did it in our high school class, of the presidential limousine turning from Main Street onto Houston Street, heading toward the depository. Some innocent person in the depository is taking a movie. I said to my students, so okay, Oswald is ostensibly a Marine sharpshooter, although he hasn't fired a gun officially in some time. If you're Oswald and you're a trained Marine, when are you going to shoot the president? Well, one boy who was proficient with guns said, well, that's obvious. You would shoot him as he's coming toward you. He's getting bigger all the time. You can shoot him right in the face. He's got a whole big parade behind him. They can't get out of the way or back up or anything. They're sitting ducks. They're stuck. Every second he comes, he gets closer and is a better target. And I said, okay, so now let's look at the reenactments that the FBI took afterwards. Why would you wait to shoot him when he's going away from you? It's a downhill slope, so the car's gaining momentum. there's a big oak tree partially in the way, and they're about to accelerate to go under the triple underpass and immediately gas the car to go up the entrance ramp for the Stemmons Freeway to go to his speaking engagement. Why? And he's getting smaller all the time, and the oak tree's in the way. Why would you wait until then? And the kid said, that's easy. You'd only do that if you were catching him in a crossfire. There's no other reason to wait. So again, it defies all logic, just all these things. Maybe if you took one thing separately, you could say, okay, we can excuse that. But when you take all these things and put them together and all the connections and all the coincidences, it's just like people who came forward to the Warren Commission and tried to correct things, or railroad workers who were up in the switch towers in the railroad yard above the triple underpass and saw men behind the grassy knoll and tried to bring that. A lot of these people, 42 in fact, in 2 years after the assassination, met untimely deaths. And it's like, okay, you talk to an insurance person who's in the actuarial business. That's statistically impossible for all these people to die within 2 years who are just connected by one single event in one moment in time.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. Do you mind if we go a little bit long on this stream?
No,
you
I'm
got time?
fine. I gave my whole afternoon. I don't care.
Awesome. Because we got a lot to sift through. I mean, that's you're overflowing to information over here. And we're gonna try to pick at you a little bit.
You could ask me some questions.
Josh, you probably
Well,
got a few.
Yeah, I guess I don't. A lot of the things you brought up. I mean, I've either read myself or you're a teacher and you're obviously well read on the subject, so I take it on faith. But I guess I think a big reason that the JFK files are kind of interesting to people is because, like you said, it was a very shocking thing to see the United States president be killed.
Oh yeah.
And like you said, you drew up a lot of comparisons between JFK and Donald Trump. And how he's a establishment kind of shaker-upper, so to speak.
A disruptor.
A disruptor. And so clearly there's a lot of people who had something to gain from his death. I guess, and you're a teacher, you've brought up a lot of facts here. But eventually, for all of these parties to come together, this is something I was talking about with someone else, behind the scenes, was people bring up the mob connection to and what the mob had to gain from killing JFK. But I don't think that the mob went to the CIA, or the mob went to the oil guy. Maybe they did, but I think the mob was involved, obviously. But I guess if we're getting into speculation now, who do you think was the first person out of all these people, all these parties that may or may not have been involved, that were either directly involved or complicit in it?
Yeah.
Like LBJ. Who do you think got the ball rolling on saying, let's shoot JFK?
It's hard to say. I kind of think maybe, a lot of these people travel in the same circles. Like there's renegade elements in the CIA that had to deal with renegade elements in the mob. Even before Castro took over while the revolution was going on, the CIA was involved in Cuba, and out of necessity, they had to deal with these big mobsters at their casinos and such. And then you had people who were disaffected when the Bay of Pigs went south. There's even a connection with George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st president. At the time, he had owned an oil company called Zapata, and they had oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, on the way to Cuba. And supposedly, he was complicit with the CIA and actually worked as a back channel operative for the CIA. He later became the CIA director in the 70s. But he had, clandestine drop-offs of CIA money and operatives at some of his oil rigs. And there's a picture of him, of someone who looks exactly like him, standing in the door of the school book depository as Kennedy's being shot. A bunch of people are looking toward the grassy knoll. He's looking in the other direction. And it's grainy. You can't tell for sure if it's him, but they took a picture of him that was concurrent to the day and superimposed it, and boy, it matches right up. Interestingly, they also asked him, where were you the day Kennedy was shot? I don't remember. Well, that's malarkey. I was 6 years old. I remember exactly. And additionally, and I didn't even know this till recently, John Hinckley Jr., who shot Reagan, okay, his parents were big oil tycoons in Texas, and they were like that with the Bush family. Now, who would have become president if Reagan would have succumbed to his wounds, which he nearly did? Now, there's nothing definitely linking, but there's just all these coincidences. But to get back to your original question, I kind of think some of these people, maybe we're at a, you go out for a drink to a bar, or, you have a little dinner party, and some of these people whose paths cross out of necessity anyway, oh, that SOB Kennedy, look what he's done now. Wouldn't it be great if he was out of the way? And, the mob felt double-crossed, particularly up in Chicago, because of what Sam Giancana had done to deliver the state, which put Kennedy over the top. And the father had made deals with Giancana. Unfortunately, the father suffered a debilitating stroke less than a year into JFK's presidency, so he didn't even have the ability to negotiate or talk or anything anymore. And JFK probably didn't even know what backdoor deals his father had made. So I kind of think it might have started on the whole cocktail party set where people start talking. I don't know who would have started it, but then, that doesn't sound like a bad idea. Well, let's get this and that one together, and, and I think it just took on a life of its own, kind of, and I think then, once they sort of had a plan in place, then they sort of, Mr. Vice President to Johnson. Then you have Jack Ruby. A lot of people don't know this. Jack Ruby grew up in Chicago, worked for Al Capone as a kid, moved to Dallas later on, was big into narcotics down there and a frontman for the mafia. His Carousel strip club was actually financed by the mafia. There's telephone records showing overabundance of telephone calls between his strip club and mob centers and mob telephone numbers in Chicago and New Orleans and Tampa, going back and forth right up through the assassination weekend. And then you have Ruby supplying drinks at a club right across the street to Secret Service agents the night before they were on Kennedy's detail till 3 and 4 in the morning, when the, protocol states that, 24 hours prior to your duty, you're not to have an alcoholic beverage. And then you have the whole motorcade route, and that was planned, by Johnson and John Connolly, who were mostly Johnson, who were movers and shakers. Now, they could have gone right down Main Street, if you look at a map of Dallas, and would have directly come to an entrance ramp for the Stemmons Freeway. And by the time they got to where Maine and Houston met, the crowds had dissipated, had really thinned out. You can even see that in the Zapruder film. There's not a bazillion people lying the streets like there were in downtown Dallas. And it was totally against Secret Service protocol for them to make that right, not so much the right turn, but then that oblique left turn from Houston onto Elm, where the car would have had to slow to 8 miles an hour to make the turn, when they could have taken the direct route to get on the freeway. It wasn't like there were big crowds by the time they got to the book depository. So I just think, it's hard to say who started the conversation, but I think it maybe started in bars or cocktail parties where some of these people all got together and it just took on a life of its own.
So an accidental conspiracy.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking that way. I mean, I don't know if there was really a puppet master to start, but I think.
Well, I guess the primary question that is really being asked right now is, especially on the younger generations, is how much involvement did like Mossad and Israel have in this, as you call it, a accidental conspiracy?
Well, what I've been able to determine in the limited time I had to look at it was that Meyer Lansky, who was really the brains and the architect of the modern mafia, he was one of the original mafiosa going back when the mob really started gaining traction in the 20s during Prohibition. And after some of these turf wars, particularly like you see on old 1920s gangster movies and even film footage of the day where they're shooting each other up and it's a big bloodbath, he's like, look, this is insane. We need to divide up the country into different spheres of influence, form a commission, and run this thing like the government instead of killing each other all the time. And we need to treat it more like a business. So Meyer Lansky is the one who drew up this commission and, this almost governmental way of the mob governing itself. And, like you couldn't perform a hit on a made man without getting approval from the commission. And you had to stay out of this territory or that territory. And Meyer Lansky, had obviously connections with all the other big mobsters. And being of Jewish origin, he also was heavily involved in Israel after its creation in 1948 as being a friend to Israel. And he had some connections to the Mossad. Now, I haven't seen anything where anyone in the Mossad was directly involved with any of the planning or killing of JFK. I did see some snippets where perhaps certain elements may have had some advance notice that this was going to happen. But again, that's about all I've been able to find so far. I don't know if you guys have looked any of this up or any of our listeners have, or.
So some of the things that I'm aware of is James Angleton. Do you know who James Angleton is?
No, never heard of him.
Okay, so he was not the head of the CIA, but he was in the CIA, and he got his, I don't know what you would call him, like sort of a project leader or something.
Was this during the time of JFK?
Yes.
Okay.
Because he actually was part of OSS during World War II.
Okay.
He was a non-Jewish person from Idaho, and he basically was involved with OSS during World War II, recruiting spies and finding spies leaving Germany. And a lot of his informants were Jewish people leaving Germany and leaving Europe. And conversely, like after World War II, it was a lot of Jewish people leaving the Soviet Union. And so he was recruiting all these people. And then, in 1948, the creation of Israel, they're going there. And they still had those connections, both through, the OSS, CIA was involved with the mob as well. So that he basically was, he wasn't Jewish himself, but he had a lot of Jewish informants.
Right.
And he was someone who's lauded as being he was one of these Red Scare people. Like he was paranoid about the Soviet Union. And he did not like JFK's stance on somewhat neutrality, basically that. So he's a name that gets brought up a lot due to his connection to Mossad. And apparently there was a document released during the Joe Biden administration that has to do with one of the informants that was reading Lee Harvey Oswald's mail. It was released that the CIA was monitoring Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yep.
And I forget his name, but he was a Jewish person who reported directly to I'm bad with name. Who's the guy I'm talking about? What's his
Englehart?
James Angleton. Sorry.
Angleton,
James Angleton. And so he's a name that gets brought up in these circles. And one of the motives that we hear a lot for why Israel would benefit, and again, like you said, there's no shortage of people that would benefit.
And I always thought the
this.
Kennedys became pretty pro-Israel. Bobby especially. Bobby Sr., I mean. Yeah.
The theory that I've heard is JFK was not in favor of Israel nuclearizing.
Okay, that I could believe.
David Ben-Gurion, who was the basically modern day Israel's George Washington, he was obsessed with getting a nuclear device.
Okay,
and JFK was opposed to this. They had I forget the name of the facility, but they had a civilian nuclear reactor program, and Kennedy was afraid that they were secretly developing a nuclear device. So he wanted inspections. He kept pressuring David Ben-Gurion to, neutral inspections. And he basically, it was released at one point, he gave David Ben-Gurion an ultimatum. He said, we're not going to support you anymore unless you respond to our inspection request.
Yeah.
The next day, David Ben-Gurion resigns, and then 3 months later, JFK is killed.
Yeah, which doesn't surprise me because JFK was interested after the Cuban Missile Crisis of curtailing nuclear weapons in general. He was trying to organize a test ban treaty with Russia, which to some extent became reality. And he made a very famous speech the summer of '63 at American University where he touched on, the things he was thinking about Vietnam and also was wanting to dial down nuclear weapons. So it doesn't surprise me that he wouldn't want whichever country it was, any Johnny-come-lately to get nuclear weapons when he was trying to curtail them.
Mm-hmm.
It might not have been anything to do with his views on Israel itself, just in general. We don't need any more nukes or people having them. It's bad enough as it is.
Right.
And we can't forget Jack Ruby was also Jewish.
Mm-hmm. Rubenstein was his real name.
That's correct. And another interesting thing was that where this Fair Play for Cuba committee was, it's been shown that perhaps Ruby actually traveled there to New Orleans and met with Oswald. And I forget the exact address, but it's something or other Camp Street in New Orleans. It turns out that address, it's the same building, but their offices are on the other street with ostensibly a different address. But in that same building on Camp Street are offices of the CIA, specifically with two men named Guy Bannister and David Ferry, who were both CIA operatives and also were linked to Oswald, and that Jack Ruby knew both of them as well. So it's just really kind of a very cozy situation there. And if you even look in some of the impromptu news conferences they had at the jail when Oswald was arrested, he even says, I wish someone would come forward. I am just a patsy.
I think they went and interviewed his sister after the Dallas shooting, after Oswald's shooting, and she basically said the same thing, that he told her he was going to be a patsy prior to the shooting happening.
Right. And then you have Ruby. Now, what's interesting is that David Ferry and Guy Bannister that worked at that CIA office, they were ostensibly involved with a company in New Orleans that was doing cancer research. But in reality, and I forget, I don't have it in my notes, but I read this when I was researching this. The man who was head of the American Cancer Society knew of them and was working with them. And they were ostensibly working on cures for cancer. Instead, what they were actually doing was working on ways to spread cancer in an assassination attempt. And the CIA was involved in something called Operation Mongoose, which was to go after and assassinate Fidel Castro. Now, Kennedy, when he found out about it, said, no more, we're not doing this. But I think, the CIA continued without his blessing. And they had all sorts of harebrained things set up, everything from exploding cigars to developing this cancer injection where they would have supposedly in a Mission Impossible type routine gotten someone to put this in his food or inject him somehow to where it would have caused lung cancer, and there would have been plausible deniability to, hey, he's always smoking a cigar, he caught cancer, la, la, la. Where it becomes real interesting is after the fact, a lot of people don't know this, Ruby was actually charged with Oswald's first-degree murder and convicted and sentenced to the electric chair. Well, he never got executed because, of course, you have automatic appeals and that sort of thing. Well, some news people, and again, it's on, you can look it up on YouTube or any of these things. Ruby's there saying, when the Warren Commission comes to interview him, look, I'd like to tell everything, but I can't tell it here. My life's in danger. If you bring me to Washington and sit me in front of a Senate or House subcommittee under oath, I'll tell you whatever you want to know, but I can't do it here. And additionally, he's shown in a thing saying, now, Adlai Stevenson had run for president in 52 and 56 on the Democratic side, lost astoundingly to Eisenhower, but was mentioned as a possible vice presidential candidate to balance the ticket for JFK, being a Midwesterner. Well, JFK instead chose Johnson. Ruby, in this interview says, well, it's too bad. If Adlai Stevenson had been vice president, this never would have happened. You can lay it all at the doorstep of the current president. And what else is really weird, Richard Nixon knew a little bit too. He was once asked if he knew who killed Kennedy, and he kind of provided an evasive answer. He said, well, Lyndon Johnson and I both desperately wanted to be president. The difference is I wasn't willing to kill for it. Now, there's something else. The assassination weekend, you guys are too young to remember this, but TV used to sign off at 11 or 12 o'clock at night, and they'd go to a test pattern. Then at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, it would renew again. Well, the assassination weekend was the very first time that TV was on for 24/7 for 3 days. And Nixon had lost the presidential election to JFK. Actually, a lot of people don't know this. Despite being political rivals, they actually had been personal friends while in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, and often, consulted with each other on policy. So Nixon had lost the presidential election. Had also in 62 lost the gubernatorial election in California, and was at that time just a private lawyer with a firm in New York City. Well, like everyone else, he had his TV on during this whole thing. And, he was actually scheduled to have a luncheon meeting with a friend that Sunday afternoon. And so he was in the bathroom shaving and getting ready and alternately walking out. And his valet/bodyguard said that he walked out just as Oswald was being famously led to be transferred, and Ruby steps forward and shoots him in the gut. This man that was with Nixon said Nixon turned as white as a ghost and said, "Oh my God, I recognize that man. He's one of Lyndon Johnson's guys." And Roger Stone talks about this in his book too. So there's just...
Wow.
Yeah. Just, and, I haven't even been, this is just stuff I've stumbled across, I never would have thought this in a million years. Just reading and researching and listening to stuff.
So, how much have you gone through the recent files, and what is new? Because I know a lot of it has been out, some of it redacted, some of it not.
Yeah.
A lot of the pages that we have.
I think some of that Mossad stuff is relatively new. I think also a man called into the Glenn Beck program right after Ken's broadcast on Live 95, and he was the grandson of Billy Saul Estes, who is one of the rich people in Texas that served jail time, and Lyndon Johnson was a big donor to Johnson, and Johnson was implicated after the fact in some of the corruption. And he actually, and this was relatively new, and he went on Glenn Beck's program and, had tapes of his grandfather kind of doing a tell-all, kind of like, okay, if something, because his grandfather was apparently seeing all these people dying who are associated with this, okay, kind of like my insurance policy, if something happens to me, play this. So I think that's relatively new. I don't think there was any real groundbreaking stuff that was new from what I understand, but you got to wonder, okay, has it all been released? And how come when Trump wanted to release it during his first term in office, all these high up governmental officials fought tooth and nail against it? It's like, okay, if there's nothing to see here and it's all very generic, why would you fight it? If anything, you'd want it to get out, and it would be like, see, this is a nothing burger. And I seem to remember, too, and I just saw a quick picture of this, during Trump's first presidency, there was a picture that leaked out, and Lyndon Johnson's car was a few cars in back of JFK's car, and JFK's car has just made the turn onto Elm Street. He hasn't even been shot yet. And there's a picture showing Lyndon Johnson's car, and Johnson not visible, like he's ducking down in his car.
He's like, hold on, just tying my shoe.
Yeah. And maybe
for 20 minutes.
But Lady Bird's still sitting there, maybe considering his philandering. Maybe he thought he'd get lucky and get a twofer,
Catch a stray bullet, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know there's that famous photo of, I think it's, what was it, Lyndon B. Johnson, and kind of in the background, like I think, and he's like the only one smiling. Do you
In
know
Air
what I'm
Force One.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Kennedy famously said, because she was wearing that pink outfit and it was stained with blood, and they wanted her to change, and she said, hell no, I want them to see what they've done. She would not change her clothes all the way home. Then there's that magic bullet. Okay, there's a Secret Service agent, and let's see, I've got his name in my notes. I believe this is the right name. Some of these names all blend together, you try to keep them all separately. Oh, where is it? Well,
He's got some knowledge, don't he?
yeah, I
John?
don't see it. But anyway,
It's a lot.
this Secret Service agent actually found the magic bullet in JFK's stretcher. It wasn't found in John Connolly's, and he handed it to them. And this bullet was relatively pristine. That's the one they claim went through several layers of Kennedy's and Connolly's flesh before just stopping. And Kennedy had a bullet wound in his back that only went in about that far. Well, this bullet, it's surmised because it was found with, in fact, the Secret Service agent found it and put it on JFK's stretcher. That's what it was. And then they tried to, link it to these other things. Well, JFK had this very shallow bullet wound about that deep, maybe a quarter of an inch at the most in his back. And they say that that bullet didn't have much velocity and actually fell out of his back. And that's when the Secret Service agent found it. Well, again, to account for the time frame that was firmly established by Zapruder's film, they had to come up with this narrative where this single bullet had done all this damage. It's obviously one shot of the three explodes JFK's head, and the first shot misses and has pavement fragments come up and hit the man and his son. So, the thing is, when they removed fragments from John Connolly's wounds and weighed them all out, they weigh more than what could be possible with the pristine. In other words, the pristine bullet isn't damaged enough to account for all the fragments that the doctors took out of John Connolly, because he was hit in the hand and the leg, and I think there were 3 wounds Connolly sustained, and it just didn't add up mathematically. And then, they just had to account, and they have Kennedy grasping up here, and then they did a tracheotomy on them. Well, none other than Gerald Ford, who was also part of the Warren Commission, and he even admitted afterwards, he said, well, I altered what I said in the report about the wound being more of a throat wound rather than a back wound, just to make it all fit together. It's the only way it would fit together. And then again, you have, okay, why would you, now, Earl Warren, the Warren Report's named after him, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, he was ostensibly the leader, but the real mover and shaker was Allen Dulles. Well, why in heaven's name, out of 170 million people living in America at the time, would you pick the one guy that JFK and him hated each other, and Kennedy had fired him as director of the the CIA for mismanaging the Bay of Pigs? Why would you have that man be the de facto leader of the Warren Commission? It just does not add up unless you're doing a whitewash. And one of the phone calls between this Billy Saul-Estes and Lyndon Johnson, has them talking about Johnson. There was a taping system in the White House at the time. Johnson calling one man, and I forget his name, I'm sorry, but did not have an affinity for Kennedy. And Johnson actually saying on the tape, I want you to be my man on the Warren Commission and report back to me. I mean, why would you do all this, if everything was on the up and up?
So I got a question about questions. I'm assuming you talk to a lot of people about this stuff. What are some questions that people don't ask you that you think they probably should? What is some information that nobody really thinks about that is probably more relevant than it gets credit for?
I mean, a lot of people, and I think especially at the time, it was a different time. You took the government at face value then. You didn't think the government lied to you. But a lot of people don't necessarily ask about the CIA connection. Most people are aware of the mob connection. Most people don't ask the question. My math teacher in high school always said, when in doubt, follow the common sense of the thing. Like, okay, most people don't ask the fundamental questions of who had the most to gain, or conversely, who had the most to lose if Kennedy remained as president. Okay, and then they don't really ask. I've never heard anyone until my student and I had this discussion about, why would Oswald, as allegedly a trained sharpshooter, wait to shoot Kennedy until he's on a downward slope going away from you and the car's about to accelerate onto the freeway, and prior to that go under the underpass where, if the driver of that Lincoln convertible would have just stood on the gas, the first shot was fired, they would have been in the safety of the triple underpass. So you never hear anyone ask those questions. Also, the car was leased to the United States government by the Ford Motor Company for like a very nominal amount. I think it was $500 a year just to get, that style of Lincoln Continental had just come out in 1961.
Like promotional work.
Right, exactly. And it was a really cutting edge car for its day. And again, like look what the president rides around in. And Kennedy always had an affinity for Ford Motor products on his estate in New England. He had Thunderbirds and Galaxy convertibles and Mercury convertibles. So, it was a real feather in the cap to the Ford Motor Company. And in fact, Robert McNamara, who was Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, had been president of the Ford Motor Company. So the car is brought back to Washington. It only remains there for a couple of days, and then it's immediately sent to the Ford Motor Company back in Dearborn, Detroit, where it's stripped down and essentially a frame-off restoration is done on it. Now, why wouldn't have you impounded that car nearly forever? Now, maybe forensics weren't in 1963 what they are today, but the FBI did have one heck of a good crime laboratory that was state-of-the-art even the day. Why wouldn't have they not impounded that car almost forever to go over it like with a fine-tooth comb?
I mean, even for like a museum purpose.
Right. Well, it's currently in the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit. Oh, I'm sorry. In fact, it's...
you can pull it around if you want to see
They
it.
had actually restored it, and Presidents Johnson, of all people, Nixon, and Ford had actually used it. They changed it from being a convertible into a sedan. And I don't think after that day any presidents rode around in open convertibles anymore. But yeah, it's currently on display at the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan. I'd one day like to get there and see it.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of fitting that you pulled up in a convertible Mustang today. I saw you. I saw you pull up, and I was like, "This guy, he's playing the part." Clearly the research did not put you off driving in convertible cars.
No, but it's just it's too bad it happened, and I just think again, there's way more than meets the eye. And I mean, as a child growing up in the '60s. We were taught to respect our elders, respect the government, the police and all that. So I wasn't like, it's not like, I grew up in like a hippie type, let's buck the establishment, even though I was alive during that generation. It's not like my background was that. I was taught certain conservative things. But then when this information started coming at you that you're not even looking for, like the Zapruder film to start it off, and then you start reading these books and seeing these different facts. And then with the advent of YouTube, you can actually hear Jack Ruby in his own words, Lyndon Johnson in his own words, and all these other people, or Oswald saying, I'm just a patsy. I mean, it's not like anyone's reenacting that. It's the actual people of the day saying the things of the day. It just comes at you and hits you.
Would you consider JFK assassination like the 9/11 of the 50s?
I would, because I think you can pretty much delineate. I think you could, and I'm glad you said the 50s, because you could say that the 50s, in that almost like leave it to Beaver, everything is good mentality, ended with the JFK assassination. Let's face it, after the assassination, you had Vietnam ramping up, you had the college protests, the drug culture, all the riots that took place in the 60s due to both Vietnam and civil unrest and civil rights. You had Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, then George Wallace all being assassinated or attempted assassinations, even though they were of totally different political stripes. I sincerely think if JFK would have lived and he would have, brought down the troop levels and we wouldn't have had a Vietnam like we did. And then if we were doing these back channel negotiations with the Cubans and with the Russians and would have curtailed nuclear weapons, I really think the 60s would have turned out a heck of a lot differently than they did. I think we still would have had, the whole lunar landing, which would have been a good thing. That's one of the things JFK was striving before. He said it was his policy to put a man on the moon before the end of the 60s, which is a tribute to his legacy, did actually happen in 1969. But I think it would have been a far different world, had he not been shot in Dallas that day.
So we did land on the moon.
What's that?
So we did land on the moon.
Well,
There's
I know that's a
messing
story
with
for another day, I guess.
I'm
The
messing
whole
with you.
flag waving thing. Huh?
But I guess the question, I kind of call back to a 9/11. I think Josh would agree with me here. Is we attribute 9/11 to a lot of like waking up to the kind of going on behind the scenes that we have. Did that happen then, or people just kind of kept that naivety as we move forward?
Well, in the 60s, you always heard rumblings where this stinks, especially probably if Oswald hadn't been shot by Ruby, there wouldn't have been that much about it because Oswald would have stood trial. Maybe a good lawyer like an F. Lee Bailey type could have gotten him off, or maybe he would have been convicted. It's hard to say. The establishment was pretty powerful. But I do recall, even as a little kid, the instant he got shot by Ruby, it was like, well, wait a minute. This is all too, coincidental. People already started having some suspicions then. And some people who were in the know about Johnson's corruption were kind of whispering, gee, I wonder if he had anything to do with it, but not any outright, accusations. It's kind of like, and again, it was a different time. You didn't have back then you only had the 6 o'clock news for like half an hour on TV. I don't even know that you had an 11 o'clock news back then. My parents never let me stay up as a little kid past 9 anyway, so I didn't know. But I mean, you didn't have the 24-hour news cycle like you do today. And I think people pretty much took it face value. And I just think it's just like Kennedy's womanizing. That never came out till years later.
Really?
Yeah.
I feel like that would be obvious. I mean,
and that whole thing where Marilyn Monroe is like, happy birthday, Mr. President. I mean, yeah, but the public really didn't know or share in that. Again, we didn't have, and the media tended to protect, people in high places. John F. Kennedy, when he was president, never had less than a 60% approval rating. Today, we would consider that phenomenal, but even in his worst days, he never was below 60 to 65%, and sometimes was as high as in the 90s.
What do you think about
Wow.
Junior? JFK Jr.
Oh, with the plane crash?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think there was anything nefarious there.
It just seems like Kennedy's
Yeah, they do
disappear.
have the curse. I mean, first you have his older brother, Joe Jr., with that flying bomb, for lack of a better word, exploding during World War II. It was supposed to be where he was supposed to fly it in so far, and then they were supposed to overtake it by remote and crash it somewhere in Axis-held territory and blow up. But somehow, I don't know if the radio signal got tripped prematurely, but it blew up with him still at the controls. And then you have the one daughter, Rosemary, who's seen Joe Kennedy Sr. had a frontal lobotomy performed on, and she was essentially like a vegetable and institutionalized after that. And then you had, one of the other daughters, I forget which one, dying in a plane crash. I think it was Kathleen, which was JFK's favorite sister. And then you had, of course, Bobby Kennedy, and then Ted Kennedy at Chappaquiddick with his secretary getting killed in that car crash and drowned. And then, of course, JFK Jr. But I think JFK Jr., he was kind of a newbie pilot, and they say he might have gotten confused where the horizon met the water, and it's easy to get turned upside down. There was fog, or there was some other weather condition. I don't know. You're acting like you might know more about it than me.
I don't know a lot about it, but I wouldn't intentionally crash a plane on accident.
Well,
yeah.
So because I'm not a pilot, I did want to become one, and I recently met someone in Colombia who's training to be one, and he and I became friends, and he's been taking me up a lot. And I don't know much about the JFK Jr. plane crash, but what he did is he told me, and maybe they started doing this because of that, but he told me, he was like, to test your senses when there's fog, he's like, cover your eyes, don't peek, and I'm going to move the plane around, and you try and tell me, like with my hand, what direction, like, are we going down, are we going up, kind of up and to the left, and like I did it, and I was able, based on like minor things, to kind of tell which direction we were going.
Okay.
I guess for people that don't fly in small aircraft, it's easy to think that might happen. I don't know if you have any experience in that,
but whatsoever.
After doing that and hearing and kind of hearing about that, I find it a little hard to believe he wouldn't realize that he had turned upside down.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so
getting lost in the fog is one thing, but being completely upside down is another.
Yeah. I've never heard anything nefarious about it, but again, it's not something I'm well versed in.
Sure.
Well, we got RFK. Let's see how long he sticks around.
Yeah.
RFK Jr.
Yeah, I was worried about that. And then, maybe drawing a little bit on the Trump parallel, whether you like him or hate him or somewhere in between, doesn't really matter. But, it's very eerie to me. You have this guy on the rooftop of a building, and there's no security up there. Ostensibly they're saying, oh, gee, the pitch was too high or it was too hot. Well, I own a similar building that I keep my classic cars in. And, I'm in my 60s. And I've been up on the roof of my building, and I would think if my fat old butt could get up there, that some Secret Service or policeman who's in his 20s or 30s and in peak physical condition could do that as well. I smell a rat. And then let's talk about this kid. We're talking about a kid who was kind of a loner in school, kind of a never-do-well, didn't have many friends, sketchy background, white t-shirt, kind of weird views. First he's a Democrat, then he's a Republican, donates and all that. It's just kind of a weird individual all the way around. Okay. When I describe that person, did I just describe William Crooks, or did I just describe Lee Harvey Oswald? About the same thing, aren't they?
Yeah.
So I haven't disclosed this yet. So I was in the Marine Corps, and I was a scout sniper in the Marine Corps.
Okay.
And so I've looked at the JFK shooting, and there was at least 3 shooters, at least from my opinion.
Right.
And then so I also looked at the shooting of Donald Trump. Some people have done some audio analysis, and there were 3 guns fired that day.
Right.
One being the Secret Service returning fire, one being Crooks, and then there was another set of 4 bullets that were fired from another gun
Right.
in the same direction of Crooks, just about 20 to 40 yards
Right.
further on. And so what I and many other people have come to is that there was we call them hideouts, final firing positions in the building behind that building, behind Crooks, and they shot over the top of him from being deep set inside of the window, so you couldn't see him because of the way.
And similarly, there's been accusations of that vis-a-vis Oswald too, and that also possibly one of the other on-high shooters was in the Dow Tex building, which was right next door to the book depository.
That's just how we work. That's how tactics
It's classic
operate.
triangulation.
Yes.
That everything I've read about, and I'm not even conversant with guns. And I just think there's more to it. In fact, there's even people who said, like with Crooks during Kennedy, hey, there's a guy with a gun poking out of this building, and people did nothing. Similarly, when the shots were fired, everyone runs toward the grassy knoll. No one runs toward the book building. And some of the people who got there first were met by people waving Secret Service badges and, one policeman in uniform. And then they looked at records. There were no Secret Service agents or policemen posted near the grassy knoll that day.
Yeah, there's also been a lot come out on the association with the local police department and Josh Shapiro, which would be the governor of Pennsylvania. And,
yes.
And there's a lot of connection there. So, I mean, you could almost parallel that to the mob-esque.
Yeah. Yeah.
setup.
And it's kind of,
He's also Josh Shapiro also has a history of killing people. So
right. Well, Lyndon Johnson had a history of, people being killed. And
Did he?
And he had some henchmen. There was one man, you can look it up. Gosh, and it was talked about in this podcast, this tape by Billy Sol Estes's grandson. And also, he's the guy who called into Glenn Beck. And then there's another man who talked about it too. This one henchman of Johnson goes in to a golf club and shoots a man point blank and is convicted. Johnson intercedes on his behalf because allegedly it possibly was a Johnson hit. And the guy receives a sentence of, I think, 5 years for manslaughter, which is then suspended. And I forget the man's name, but if you look up that Billy Sol Estes tape, he's mentioned there, and he's also mentioned in other circles. Also, the corruption that Johnson had in concert with this Bobby Baker, who was convicted of the vending machine things, and Billy Sol Estes also had to do with government subsidies in the early 60s for grain storage and ammonia farm storage. And I don't know exactly how it worked, but the gist of it was if you built these grain storage facilities and stored grain and were willing to build these ammonia storage facilities, I remember seeing them, like big, tall, blue silo-looking things. The government would pay you a subsidy for the construction and storage of these items for future use. Well, I guess Lyndon and Bobby Baker and Billy Sol Estes hatched this scheme where, okay, we'll get earmarked for the government subsidies. And of course, Lyndon was at the time Senate Majority Leader before he was topped to be vice president. And they get all this money, then never build the facilities or buy the product to put in the facilities. Well, this one man, a government auditor, comes along and wants to do an audit on, the facilities don't exist. Well, Lyndon starts in first he'll try to charm you like, well, shucks, you're doing such a good job. wouldn't you want a supervisory position in Washington with a plush, fancy office and a commensurate raise? Well, the guy was a Boy Scout and wasn't having any of it. A couple weeks later, he shows up dead on his property outside his pickup truck with 2 allegedly self-inflicted gunshot wounds to the head.
Always.
Yeah.
Which part of the head?
Yeah, exactly.
The back of the head, always.
Can you say Vince Foster, boys and girls?
Earlier you mentioned about how they were going to, I guess, I don't know, it reminded me of something about COVID where they created a virus and then tried to create a solution for it. I think you mentioned cancer and something else.
Oh yeah, and here's what I was leading up to, but I got sidetracked. Is Jack Ruby, after they wouldn't bring him to Washington to testify, all of a sudden this doctor started visiting the jail where Ruby was being held pending his death sentence appeals. And, well, you need this, you need that medication, and started injecting him with things. And before long, Ruby contracts and dies of cancer. And again, there's that whole CIA thing, and who was this doctor who was visiting the jail, and why did Ruby, who was heretofore healthy, suddenly contract inoperable cancer?
They gave him a COVID vaccine.
So
Yeah.
So yeah, you had mentioned these harebrained schemes by the CIA, and I forget who you said they were with the cigar that they were
Castro.
Castro.
Right.
Was the form of cancer assassination, was this supposed to be like fast acting, and it was like or like a poison that like it gave you cancer, so in an autopsy it'd be like, oh, he had cancer.
Right. That's what it was supposed to be like. It wasn't supposed to be like you would die instantaneously, but rather you would contract a fast acting.
And
like when you hear of people, they go to the doctor, they get opened up, and within a month or two, the doctor, when he opens you up, says, oh my gosh, we can't do anything, and within a month or two, you're dead.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be that sort of a deal.
So like a couple months.
Right, probably.
Okay. All right. Because I was going to say, like, a cancer gun, how long, that could be years. It could be.
Right, exactly. This was supposed to be relatively quick acting, but not instantaneous.
Right. Not like, we found cyanide on him.
Right.
The killer's still here. He can't be more than a few miles away.
It was supposed to be where you'd have plausible deniability and they wouldn't be able. They even had a harebrained thing where, just to embarrass Castro, they were going to give him some kind of potion that would make his beard fall out and all his hair fall. I mean, they were really ludicrous, some of the things they came up with. And
I remember I saw this documentary once about, like, I forget all the parties involved, but it was someone, they were trying to spy on somebody else. And what they did was they attempted to craft a bullet with a microphone in it. Mm-hmm. And what they were going to do is they were going to shoot the bullet at the guy's head in his office, intentionally miss, it'd crack the window.
Oh, yeah,
and people would think that, this was a failed assassination attempt, and it was supposed to have a secondary bullet on the back that detached. So when they went to go find the bullet, they'd find one, but the other bullet would be in there, and it was a microphone into his office, which it didn't work.
Yeah.
I mean, it was way too complicated and damaged the microphone. But I remember hearing that the CIA was involved in a project like that.
And a lot of people don't realize, too, they were going to try to assassinate JFK in Tampa, Florida, the week before when he was on a trip. But then the logistics didn't work out. Allegedly, they couldn't get all the people in place, and they called it off. Similarly, when JFK was still president-elect and hadn't been sworn in, he was down at the family compound that winter because he wouldn't have been inaugurated till January 20th. And I think it was sometime over the Christmas holidays. Remember, Mrs. Kennedy was just in the process of giving birth to John Jr. She was very outwardly pregnant the night JFK won the election in November of 60. And anyway, this assassin And I know because my parents had a car just like this when I was a little kid, had a 1949 Oldsmobile and had loaded it up with explosives and was going to drive it when JFK was leaving to go to church that morning and walking out for his limo, drive it into the limo and detonate it and kill him. But then he saw Mrs. Kennedy carrying the baby and Caroline walking out, and he got cold feet because he didn't want to kill the whole family, and then was later apprehended. So there were...
So we know that to be true?
Yeah, because he was actually arrested and served prison time.
Because my next question was going to essentially be, chat says the cancer was probably a lie so they could poison him with something. Yeah, that's exactly right. It was a cover. My next question was essentially going to be, why would they kill him in Dallas in the open on the TV screen and not some other way? Is there a reason it needed to be televised?
Well, no. You mean Ruby killing Oswald or just killing Kennedy?
Kennedy.
Okay, well, it wasn't televised. Again, we got to remember, it wasn't what it is today.
Okay.
They just had, if you can go back and
why would that just seems a lot of work?
The footage was civilian footage.
Right, this man who owned a garment shop, and coincidentally, Abraham Zapruder, I don't think it really matters, but he was Jewish, but he owned a garment shop. And I think a dry cleaners too, and it was right near Dealey Plaza. And he had heard that was the motorcade route, so he and his lady assistant closed the store temporarily. And he was a kind of a photography aficionado, and had just gotten, as a gift or had bought for himself this up to the minute for the time state-of-the-art movie camera, and said, let's go out and film the presidential motorcade as it goes by. So he was just taking private movies. There was no network TV or anything like that. And, and that's what the assassins were banking on. There was some film footage of downtown Dallas with the big crowds, and when he lands at the airport and he and Mrs. Kennedy get off the plane, and there's footage, and how he makes an impromptu thing of walking to the fence without the Secret Service's blessing and shaking hands with the crowd, then getting into the car, and then the network TV shows the car leaving. Then there's other TV cameras right in the middle of Dallas where the crowd is 3 and 4 people deep. But then there's nothing official. Any of that footage taken of when he's shot is just, the audience just by happenstance taking still photos or filming him. In fact,
it was a complete accident, and they never counted on any.
If
any
not
footage
for Abraham Zapruder and his film, which limits the timeline, they could have told any wild story they wanted to, and no one could have been the wiser for it. It's just he happened to be in the right place at the right time, and he was standing on like a pedestal for a monument so he would get an over-the-top view. And lady was kind of holding him steady so the camera wouldn't shake.
So how long after the assassination did this footage really come out and start circulating?
You said 75, I think.
Well, yeah, Life magazine heard about it within a couple of days, and they made Zapruder some, stratospheric offer to buy the film. And then they did publish some still photos in one of their magazines.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned that.
I think in 67, but they didn't show the headshot or anything like that. They showed it up to the point where he was grasping like this and was starting to lean over toward Mrs. Kennedy. But they said, due to decency and like that, we're not going to show any more other than that. But then the actual, and these were extracted from the moving pictures. Then in 75, the film in its entirety as a film was released and publicized. But yeah, there was no network TV coverage or anything. I mean, they thought where they were doing this, on the outskirts, just as they were about to get on the freeway, it's like, this is a perfect spot. This Dealey Plaza is a perfect spot for triangulation. There's not going to be much in the way of crowds because they're about to accelerate onto the freeway to his luncheon and speaking engagement. And so it's a great place and a great time to get them. That's
what kind of operation did they push to kind of cover that up before the footage came out in full and then after the footage came out?
Well, before the footage came out, you could say the Warren Commission. Famously, J. Edgar Hoover almost immediately said, oh, this is the work of a lone gunman. And we must remember J. Edgar Hoover and the Kennedys hated each other. I don't know if you knew that or not, but they did. J. Edgar Hoover, Bobby Kennedy Jr., Bobby Kennedy Sr., as Attorney General, was nominally J. Edgar Hoover's boss. Well, J. Edgar Hoover was in his mid to late 60s by then, and it had passed the mandatory retirement age. But of course, he had enough dirt on the Kennedy boys with the womanizing and stuff where kind of like, I think I'm keeping my job, aren't I? Bobby Kennedy used to like to toy with J. Edgar Hoover. He had a buzzer button installed where he would buzz J. Edgar Hoover to come into his, and that used to irk J. Edgar Hoover. Well, and I'm sure you knew J. Edgar Hoover, it's come out in recent years, was gay.
Mm-hmm.
And his lifelong partner or husband was the assistant director. Clyde Tolson was his name.
Aren't they all gay?
Yeah. And what was really funny was Bobby Kennedy Sr. had a wicked sense of humor because he was looking for J. Edgar Hoover, and Hoover's secretary said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Attorney General, but the director is out today for medical reasons." So Bobby Kennedy Jr. goes back to his office and, "Yeah, we can't find him. He's out. He's having some type of medical procedure." Without missing a beat, Clyde Tolson they were looking for. He's having a medical procedure. And without missing a beat, Bobby Kennedy says, "Oh, what kind of medical procedure? A hysterectomy?" And got everyone laughing about it. So he took every opportunity to embarrass J. Edgar Hoover. So J. Edgar Hoover, actually Bobby Kennedy, the day of the assassination, was having a luncheon meeting at his home in Hickory Hill. And J. Edgar Hoover calls Bobby Kennedy up and says, "First, shots were fired at the president. I'll tell you more later." And then he just calls up Bobby Kennedy very matter-of-factly 30 minutes later and says, "The president died," and hangs up. And is just and all of a sudden, within an hour or two, "Oh, well, this was the work of a lone gunman." And then Lyndon Johnson afterwards, when he's talking to J. Edgar Hoover, and there's even recordings you can look up of this from the White House taping, where basically they're talking about, okay, we have to get this commission established to investigate and convince the public that this was a lone nut gunman that did this. I mean, it's like they've got the foregone conclusion. We've got the conclusion we want. Now we just have to make the evidence match our conclusion, no matter how much we have to twist and turn it and spin it.
Well, again, I mean, that reminds me of 9/11. I mean, they knew Al-Qaeda did it before the towers were even on the ground.
Right, right.
So, I mean, it's like they craft these narratives and then try to make the evidence fit.
And a lot of people don't even realize it. There was a precedent for 9/11 that Al-Qaeda studied. A lot of people don't know this, but in the waning days of World War II, it was either a B-24 or a B-25 got lost in the fog totally by accident and crashed into the Empire State Building and
Yes.
deposited fuel down the elevator shafts and created a fairly large fire. The difference being it was on a Saturday morning and not many people were at the Empire State Building, so very few people died other than the plane crew. And the Empire State Building was built on traditional girder and frame construction, where a crash like that wouldn't have taken that type of building down, whereas the trade towers were built on an exoskeleton type thing where all the support was on the outside. And when you crash through it, particularly the second pilot, you can see him wiggle his wings and he hits it at about a 45-degree angle to really compromise the structure. And he does it a little lower to where there's enough weight on top where even though it was the second building hit, it's the first one to collapse. But they took a lot of their playback from that playbook from the purely accidental crash that occurred during World War II into the Empire State Building.
Yeah, me and Josh don't believe
The official narrative.
the official narrative on that one. I guess we'll have to wait till it comes out.
Okay.
Till we get the 9/11 files. You know, I mean, I'm 30. Maybe we'll get them when I'm 90.
What do you
80
guys
years.
think it was a inside job?
Yeah, we think it was a demolition from the inside.
Okay. Yeah.
It
And
just-
the planes were just patsies a la Oswald.
I think they were holograms.
I wouldn't go, I mean, I don't think they're holograms, but
Kidding,
I
I'm
do.
There's
Did anyone dance in the celebration? I mean, there were a lot of people dancing. Specifically, some
photographers.
Israelis on the top of the park.
the thing that kind of puts it over the edge for me, because it, and we don't have to get too off on this, but like the idea that it was demolished intentionally, like like the support was exploded. I think those arguments, they have enough plausible deniability. Building 7 is what kind of puts it over the edge for me.
Yeah, that's the one that fell like a day later or something.
It fell with no plane crash, and
Right,
I
that's
would
right.
I would also put the
Like debris supposedly
Yes.
compromised it. Yeah.
and the Pentagon also. I mean, there was no plane debris at all at that crash
Yeah.
site.
Now, what about the first attempt on the trade towers in 1993? Was that also, in your opinion,
I haven't looked into that one too much.
where the bomb detonated in the basement?
Oh, in the basement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That obviously less attention has been given to that one.
Right.
But it's fishy.
Yeah.
I find it fishy.
Yeah. I just see in the whole JFK thing, kind of like the assassination with Trump, these are guys that the establishment cannot control. They're going to do things their way. You can't bribe them. You know, in JFK's day, you know, you couldn't really threaten them with the womanizing because the media wouldn't go along with it back then. So, you know, you had to do something else. And I just think there were a lot of people with a lot to lose or a lot to gain, you know, depending on which way it went.
So let me ask you about that. You had mentioned that the media wouldn't go along with the womanizing narrative of the Kennedy brothers, the Kennedy boys. And I don't know, like, you would understand it better than I. So you think that if the CIA had released that, or J. Edgar Hoover had released that to the media, they wouldn't report on it? And is it, maybe they wouldn't in Kennedy's case because he was so popular.
Right.
Okay.
Right. I mean,
right.
he was really the darling of the media. The media loved him. And, you know, the media's always leaned a little left. But of course, if Kennedy were alive today, if you looked at his policies, anti-communist, building up the military, the space race, lowering taxes, you know, inciting, you know, the economy, I mean, he'd be considered a conservative Republican today. I mean,
Right.
I mean, he would be appalled at what his party has become.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I remember I was talking when the JFK files were initially released. I was talking with one of my sisters about this, and I had like casually mentioned in conversation that he
Yeah.
was a Democrat president, and she was
Right.
like, "What? I thought he was a good guy." And I'm like, "Well, like,
Yeah.
history, the Republicans and the Democrat parties, they haven't always been what they are
No.
today."
Well, even look at FDR and Harry Truman. I mean, Harry Truman's the guy who dropped the atom bombs. And they actually interviewed, I looked at this in 1958, like 13 years later. They interviewed Harry Truman again. And, they're talking about, by this time people are scared of the weapons race and all. And they say, well, in hindsight, there's revisionist people saying that we shouldn't have done that and all. And Harry Truman said, I'd do the same thing all over again. If we would have had to invade the Japanese home islands, it would have lengthened the war by 2 years, probably cost 500,000 more American casualties and several million Japanese casualties. We did the right thing, and I stand by what I did.
Interesting.
And and as he pointed out, it took 2 bombs 3 days apart to convince them. If they'd been ready to surrender, surely they would have done it after the first one.
Right. So I'm kind of hearkening back now. I did want to ask you.
Yeah.
Like I'm versed well enough on like some of the mafia aspects of it, CIA aspects of it, and a little bit of the foreign policy aspects of the JFK assassination when it came to Israel and Cuba to a certain extent. And I'm familiar with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but what kind of give me the like teacher rundown of what exactly went down with the Bay of Pigs? What was that?
What had happened was, and this had been inherited from the Eisenhower administration, it was a clandestine thing where ostensibly these people were supposed to be disaffected Cubans who had fled Castro. And we got to remember, too, Castro's predecessor, Batista, was not a nice guy either. I mean, he was a dictator, but he was kind of like our dictator, kind of like the Shah of Iran versus the Ayatollah. The Shah of Iran was not a nice guy.
Right.
But, he allowed our companies to, I'm talking about Batista, allowed our companies to make lots of money in Cuba, allowed the mafia and their casinos and hotels to make lots of money in Cuba. So everyone was copacetic and very happy because the cash and the booze and the Cuban cigars were flowing both ways. In fact, Kennedy famously, before he announced the embargo on Cuba, made sure he ordered a lifetime supply of Cuban cigars.
That's pretty funny.
So in any event, what'd you ask me about the Cuban thing, didn't you?
The Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I digressed there a little bit and forgot the original question. But in any event, the Bay of Pigs was a clandestine thing under the Eisenhower administration. In fact, Ike himself probably didn't know a lot about it and didn't really, after the fact, care for it. Of course, after the fact, you're not going to care for it, but I don't know how much he personally knew about it. I think Nixon knew more as vice president than Ike did as president. But of course, Ike is the responsible person, being the captain of the ship. But what it was supposed to be was these people who were ostensibly disaffected Cubans would be supported by CIA operatives and some black ops people to go in, invade Cuba, and either remove and or assassinate Castro and get Cuba back so that it could be more on a capitalistic foundation, get the companies, their infrastructure back, get the mafia, their hotels back. But what happened was Kennedy was led to believe that this could all be accomplished quietly and secretly without military intervention, officially by the government. But what these people who planned the Bay of Pigs, they figured, okay, Kennedy's new, he's young, we can goad him a little bit. You could almost say the way Trump got goaded into the whole COVID thing by some of the people and was to an extent naive and took their word a la Dr. Fauci, etc. So it's kind of like, okay, we're going to stage this invasion and we're going to start it. And then while it's on the ground, we're going to say, well, we need official air cover and we need some ground troops behind us. Then it would have been publicized and in so deep that it would have forced Kennedy to say, okay, let's do it. But Kennedy wasn't having any of it. He's, wait a minute. When he saw it wasn't working, I didn't sign up for this. We're not committing the federal government or the United States military to this. And he pulled the plug on it. And then those guys, to their point of view, they got ambushed and died on the beaches or got captured and tortured by Castro or what have you. But Kennedy was told in the beginning by Allen Dulles and some of the others that, oh no, this is going to be totally self-contained. You'll have deniability. It's going, there'll be some CIA covert and black ops people in there, but we guarantee it'll succeed without official intervention by the United States government. And that's what Kennedy signed off on. But then when they tried to double cross him, he wasn't having any of it.
I see.
And that's when he made his defeats an orphan speech. And he came clean. And he even said to his brother and some of his staff members, my God, I can't believe it. The more we blank up, the more popular we become. Well, probably because he was one of the first politicians to actually take ownership and responsibility.
So you mentioned some of the soldiers or operatives who made it on the ground. They were captured by Castro and killed.
Some were killed, some were tortured and imprisoned. Some were later, hostage exchanged. I guess it all depended on when you were caught, who you were. I wonder if he might know a little bit about it, having been a Marine.
We're talking about the Bay
of Pigs. And
because
So I did 4 months in Cuba.
Yeah, and it was basically just dumped in Kennedy's lap, by the Eisenhower administration, and they tried to hoodwink him.
I just know that I know real generalities of it. I've never actually dove into it, but just a bad look. But I did some time in Cuba, and we did perimeter security.
Yeah.
And we could see into Cuba. This was 2016, right before Obama opened up.
So you couldn't go into Cuba per se.
So we were about 3 or 4 months prior to Obama actually opening up. So we could see into Cuba. It was like looking back in time, man. It was like 1950s.
Oh yeah, they still drive 50s automobiles there and stuff. Yeah.
And Castro had, like I said, we did perimeter security for the entire Guantanamo Bay. And there's this larger mountain over there. I mean, we have posts and they have posts, and we just look at each other for 24 hours a day for 60 years.
Yeah,
but
kind of like Korea.
Yeah, but I know you've seen pictures of Hitler's Eagle's Nest.
Right.
Well, Castro had the same thing. He had something over there where he had this oasis on top of a mountain where he just kind of chilled out and went drunk. But no, I don't know a ton on the Bay of Pigs. I don't know where y'all have gone, which I've talked about. I did have, if I can change the subject a little bit. I did have a question. You mentioned you do a little bit of research into Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
That was going to be my next question.
What's that?
Let's just start there.
Okay.
Ready, set, go.
Okay. What about Pearl Harbor?
I mean, nothing specifically. I guess me and Josh, you could call us conspiracyists. Not conspiracy theorists. We're just conspiracyists, I guess. Or at least myself, I just like to play with alternative narratives.
Oh, okay.
To the question. Do you agree with the official narrative? And if not, what are the alternatives?
I think Pearl Harbor, I think we were really just caught with our pants down. FDR had been undersecretary of the Navy, undersecretary of the Navy, and actually, like his cousin Teddy Roosevelt before him with the Great White Fleet and like that, had functioned more as the full secretary. And, he had really had an affinity for the Navy and all things nautical. So to me, the idea that he would have been complicit in letting the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, I don't think he would have done that. In fact, he actually was present during the launching of the USS Arizona, which was blown up as we know at Pearl Harbor. So
I guess one of the questions would be, the U.S. wasn't entering World War II for a lot of reasons.
right, we were basically isolationist at that point. We had seen enough with World War I. Hey guys, this ain't our sandbox, not our circus, not our monkey. You deal with it across the pond.
And then the Japanese come out of nowhere and bomb Pearl Harbor.
Well, not really nowhere. Roosevelt had been infuriated by the Japanese doing the regression in Southeast Asia, and he kind of saw some writing on the wall. So he started with embargoes, first with steel and then with oil against Japan. And Japan knew they had a finite amount of those resources. They really weren't a resource-rich country themselves. So from their viewpoint, they felt like they needed to strike to, just neutralize the colossus or the elephant in the room that was the American Pacific Fleet, so that they could have a free hand to invade Indonesia and places like that did have the oil and rubber and to some extent, steel that they would need. So I think that's what, their perspective was. What's interesting is when I taught this.
So you're saying essentially that tariffs brought the U.S. into World War II?
Embargoes. Like
Okay.
refusing to sell at any price because we want to curtail your aggressiveness in Southeast Asia. And interestingly, when I was teaching military history, a lot of people don't know this. I asked my students, do you know who fired the first shots at Pearl Harbor? It was the Americans. The captain of a U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Ward, was patrolling off the outer reaches of the harbor and noticed a tugboat called the Antares towing I forget if it was a target rack or a garbage scow, and they were opening the submarine nets to let it through. And one of the lookouts on the Ward, noticed a periscope trailing behind it, trying to follow it into the harbor. They knew there were no United States submarines, and they tried to challenge it. It wouldn't respond. So the captain of the Ward directed his forward gun crew to fire the 5-inch guns, and then as they passed over it, they laid a pattern of depth charges and sank the submarine. And they reported this in an hour and a half before the festivities started. But basically, it being a Sunday morning, they reached, some real low-level people. Well, we need confirmation. Yeah, this guy's just been captain of this ship for 2 weeks. He probably depth charged a whale or something and, just took it very lightly.
Do you think, so I'm making my way back through the series Vikings, and they attacked the British or the England settlements on Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm.
Was that a tactic that you think was intentional?
Yeah, Admiral Yamamoto.
Kind of like the Yom Kippur War.
Yeah, Admiral Yamamoto, Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied in the United States. In fact, he had attended Harvard and also the United States Naval War College as an officer in the Japanese Navy. So he was very conversant with our customs and culture. And he said, this is the best time to get them. on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
And additionally, he knew when he was kind of dragged kicking and screaming into planning this attack. When the higher ups told him, he said, personally, I think you're nuts, but if you're going to order me to do it, here's what I'm going to tell you. I know the American culture. I know the American mentality. Most importantly, I know the American industrial might. He said, if we do this, you'd better sue for peace sooner rather than later. I can run wild with the Americans for 6 months, but once they get their industrial might going, I guarantee nothing. And if you look at the timeline, it was 6 months almost to the day on June 5th and 6th, 1942, that we shellacked the Japanese Navy at Midway, sinking 4 of their frontline aircraft carriers, which they couldn't replace. And from then on out during the Pacific War, they were entirely on the defensive. But I think what may have happened was, I think it was just a comedy of errors and just overconfidence. Hey, we're an ocean away, a bit of racism, like, oh, these Japanese are these funny little buck-toothed people that wear glasses and can't shoot straight, and say, oh, so Sully, you can even look at some cartoons that Disney and Warner Brothers did during the war, and it portrays the Japanese just as that type of person, Yeah. And we didn't take them seriously. They were almost like a subhuman at the time to our popular culture. And we were complacent. Like, there were a couple things that occurred. A cruise ship that happened to be coming from the West Coast to Honolulu reportedly picked up some, odd radio transmissions and the guy on the cruise ship in the radio room didn't understand much, but he understood enough to deduce it was military in nature and possibly Japanese. And when they docked in Honolulu, he reported it to the Naval Intelligence Station. Well, protocol was not to send it to the commanders at Pearl Harbor, but to send it back to Washington for analysis. And they did nothing with it. Then there was a war warning when the 2 emissaries from Japan at the embassy went and met with the Secretary of State and said, well, we're at an impasse, and they were supposed to draft a 13-part message, and the last part was supposed to be that we're breaking off negotiations and a state of war will exist. Well, this was supposed to be delivered to the Americans an hour before hostilities started, but instead, because they fired all their clerical workers, which were American, and did hunt and peck typing, it was never delivered till after the bombs had started dropping. And when Isarako Yamamoto heard that, he said, I can think of nothing that'll infuriate the Americans more. I fear all we've done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve, which is exactly what happened.
So you think the emperor at the time, and like the higher ups in Japan, just like the cultural divide between Japanese and Americans was so starkly different that, because I'll be honest, Zeb, I kind of think that Pearl Harbor may have just happened.
Yeah,
I'm not saying it didn't. I was just asking questions.
I think it was just a culmination of
sometimes
complacency and just incompetence.
Yeah,
because there was actually, we thought when the Japanese emissaries were talking to us that it was going to go south, and they sent a war warning to Pearl Harbor, and they sent it across just regular commercial channels, through Western Union, and failed to mark it urgent. And because it wasn't marked urgent, it never got there till after the bombs started falling. Now, there is some evidence that perhaps, Winston Churchill, they had an outpost in Southeast Asia that was actually overrun by the Japanese in the same series of attacks the same week as Pearl Harbor in Singapore. Hadn't been overrun yet, but they had spies and, their version of OSS and everything. And it's entirely possible Winston Churchill could have gotten some advance warning of Pearl Harbor. But you got to remember, he was begging, they were getting battered by the Germans. They were asking FDR for assistance right and left, and FDR's hands were tied because of Congress and American isolationism. Famously, one of the head isolationists in the movement was Charles Lindbergh, who was a really revered person. Henry Ford was another one. So you have, these two big movers and shakers of the day going totally against what FDR wanted, and FDR's walking a tightrope. Well, Winston Churchill, he hears through the wind that the Japanese might be attacking. Well, that plays right into his hand. In fact, Winston Churchill said the night after Pearl Harbor, he slept like a baby, which he hadn't done in months because he knew help was on the way.
Wow.
And, it was just lucky. And again, I don't attribute to anything other than luck that the ships remaining at Pearl Harbor were our 8 battleships, which were, due to the Washington Naval Treaty, none of them had been commissioned since the early 20s. So they were somewhat obsolete at the time, even then, although they were later effective in shore bombardment and that sort of thing. But all 3 of our aircraft carriers happened to be out to sea on maneuvers and not at Pearl Harbor, and they would have been the main prize. And the Japanese were also, they were not very bright, and that they didn't bomb any of our repair or oil storage facilities. So really, other than the Arizona and the Oklahoma, all the other battleships were refloated, saw service, and very famously toward the latter stages of the war, in the battle of what was called Surigao Strait, all those alumni of Pearl Harbor found the Japanese battle fleet, crossed the T on them, and blew them out of the water. So they got their sweet revenge toward the end of the war.
How, I mean, there's a lot of kind of guessing. Do you think, how much different do you think the war would have turned out if Japan would have never attacked Pearl Harbor?
Well,
You think we would have gotten eventually?
we would have gotten in a war eventually with Japan. I think that, just they would have been more aggressive. They would have been more desperate. I think some sort of an attack. In fact, a lot of the people, well, we did get attacked in the Philippines as well, but people were aghast at the time that the Japanese fleet had sailed around the world and hit Pearl Harbor. In fact, when the reports first started coming into Washington, the naval authorities were there. You mean the Philippines, don't you? No, this is Pearl, that's being bombed. Because, the Philippines were right on their doorstep, and that's where we thought they would have attacked us first. Turns out they attacked us secondly there. There's a famous movie. I don't know if you guys are old enough to have seen it. It's got Martin Sheen in it and Charles Durning and a few other, relatively well-known actors. It's called The Final Countdown. You ever heard of it?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
You know what it is?
You've heard of it, Josh?
I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is.
It's where a nuclear aircraft carrier, the USS Nimitz, is out on maneuvers in the Pacific Ocean and gets caught in a storm, in a black hole, if you will, and goes back to the day before Pearl Harbor.
Oh,
well,
yeah,
being
okay.
a nuclear aircraft carrier with nuclear armaments and F-16s and everything, they gradually realize when they radio in to Pearl Harbor after this storm to see if everyone's all right, and they say, this is the USS Nimitz calling, and the guy at the other end is, who are you trying to kid? They don't have an aircraft carrier named after Chet Nimitz. He's still a sitting admiral. And then they go on about they do a reconnaissance flight and look at these old battle wagons all lined up. And then they have to come to grips with, well, what do we do? From an ethical point of view, do we let the time-space continuum go the way it's supposed to go, or we're sworn to uphold the Constitution and defense the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic? We know that an attack fleet is on its way. Do we single-handedly blow the whole fleet out of the water, which I'm sure they could have done?
Well, I might have to go back and watch that one.
That sounds pretty cool.
It is good. And what's really interesting is at the end, they decide to bomb the Japanese fleet. And just as they're getting ready to turn in the wind and launch aircraft, the black hole comes back and transports them to the present day. Well, there had been a helicopter crash, and one of the people on the carrier is marooned and never makes it back to the present day. When the carrier docks at Pearl Harbor, this guy, aged 40 years hence, because the movie was made in the early 80s, shows up white-haired in an expensive limousine and is rich beyond all imagination, because obviously he knows what's going to happen. And you would have bet the farm on the 1969 Mets winning the World Series, even though they said that was never going to happen, all that sort of stuff.
It's pretty cool.
They've done some alternative histories, too, about someone going back in time and thwarting the Kennedy assassination. I read a book on it, and
11/22/63.
Yeah, read there's another book I read on it, and it's too bad we didn't get to see things play out, because in the '64 election, Kennedy's Republican challenger, it was already pretty much a foregone conclusion, was going to be Barry Goldwater. Now, Kennedy and Barry Goldwater had both served in the Senate together. And although they differed on some fundamental policy issues, they were personally good friends. And Kennedy had proposed to Goldwater that in '64, he said, why don't we do this? I'll make available Air Force One to you. Let's barnstorm around the country to various, cities, and we'll give separate speeches to the same audience, and then we'll have a debate a la Lincoln and Douglas, and let the public figure it out from there, which one of us they want. And I thought, wow, that would have been a really ingenious way to campaign, much the same as, we got to remember, we take debates today as, it happens every 4 years, but Kennedy and Nixon had done the first debate since Lincoln and Douglas 100 years before them in 1960 on TV. So this really would have been cutting edge, and it might have changed the whole way our politics is done. I would have really liked to have seen something like that,
Alternative history is fun. Zeb, you're not quite so into fiction, but
yeah,
fiction
fiction's not my thing, but I enjoy thinking through things. It's just a problem, an equation.
The whole what if, it's like, what if you'd been able to just distract that whoever the gunmen were? But I'm like you. I think it was definitely at the very least, a double shooter thing, but I think more likely, just given the whole background of the parties involved, it was a triangulation type deal.
Kill box.
Right, exactly. And that Dealey Plaza was perfect for it.
Josh, we've been going for, I think, about 2.5 hours.
And it's just like Pearl Harbor, if you look at it, was a perfect kill box. I've never been there, but have you? Either of y'all ever been there?
I haven't.
I've been told by.
I've seen maps of it, but that's about it.
Yeah, I've told by everyone who's ever been there that it's a much small. Battleship Row is a much smaller area than you would think, and they were just literally sitting ducks. And here's the thing: when I was teaching full time in North Carolina, it happened to be on the 65th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, so that would have been 2006, and I was teaching world history. And the principal at the time came to me and said, Ken, I know it's out of order in the curriculum, because see, we had a really good high school band, and it was invited to play on the decks of the USS Missouri during the anniversary week. So the band was traveling out to Pearl Harbor. And he said, so you've got a lot of the 9th and 10th graders in your world history class. Even though it's out of order in the curriculum, teach them something about Pearl Harbor. So each of these 8 battleships, they had, boxing teams, baseball teams, musical bands, kind of set up just like interscholastic high school, activities would be. So I said to the kids, now look at some of these pictures of some of these crew members on these battleships. Some of them aren't much older than you. In fact, some of them even lied about their age to get into the Navy. And I said, why would have they done that? And the kids were like, well, maybe this was toward the end of the Great. And I said, a lot of these kids, it was a different time, never went more than 50 miles from home, And why would you join and go halfway around the world? And the kids were like, well, maybe toward the end of the Great Depression, jobs were scarce and, geez, join the Navy, see the world, serve on one of these big battleships, paradise, Hawaii. And I said, yeah, that was part of it. So as luck would have it, there was a battle of the bands on the shore, and I forget exactly what building it was at. But the Arizona's band won, and there's a picture of the band members receiving a big trophy. And I said to the kids, well, now I'm going to have to tell you the rest of the story. I said, those kids, some of which weren't much, if any, older than you, never got to see that picture developed because their sleeping quarters were right adjacent to the main armament magazine. And when they went back to the ship that night, they were allowed to sleep in as a reward for winning this contest. And when that Japanese plane dropped the bomb, which blew the Arizona's magazines, they were obliterated. So then I said to the kids, so let's review here. You're having a bad day because you flunked a math test or your girlfriend broke up with you? Just let it end there.
That's savage.
Beats
That's
getting
savage on
erupted.
the high school kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. We've been going a long time, but I remember learning about how the Japanese kind of custom made torpedoes to accommodate for the harbor's very, very shallow water.
Right. The harbor's only 42 feet deep. In fact, most of the battleships, when they sank, their upper works were still above water. So that's why they were able to repair them. And, it's not like they sank to the bottom. But yeah, they had to put these wooden fins on the torpedoes because if you drop the torpedo out of a plane, in normal circumstances, it would hit the mud in the bottom of the harbor and by putting these fins on it, they only dropped like maybe 20 feet and then started out moving.
Right.
And it's funny, you were in the Marines. My Uncle Louis was in the 3rd Marines, and he commanded a tank, and he fought on, and I'm sure you probably know something about Marines history. He fought on Bougainville and Iwo Jima in World War II.
Oh, yeah. Everybody knows about Iwo Jima.
Yeah. And anyway, he actually quit school in the spring of 43 when he was 17, just 2 or 3 months shy of his graduation because he wanted to get into it. And he told my grandmother, I want to go over there to the Pacific and I don't know if we're allowed to say this word on a podcast.
Say whatever you want to say,
okay.
man.
I want to kill me some little Jap bastards. Well, what he didn't count on is those little Jap bastards shot back.
They're fighting back.
And
yeah.
they were pretty accurate, and they had good weapons too. So he learned very, very quickly. But yeah, he was in the thick of it, and he wouldn't talk about it for the longest time. But then when he heard I was teaching school about it, then he really opened up to me and, wanted.
That's good. I think a lot of those stories have died off with that generation.
Yeah.
And I really wish they would have told them a lot more.
Yeah, my Uncle Eddie, who was in the second wave on Utah Beach on June 6th of 44, he was under General Omar Bradley, but sometimes under Patton, depending if Patton was in the doghouse or not. And he was more open. He joined veterans associations and, had reunions and everything. And he made like a 2-hour tape of his experiences, which I still have, a cassette tape. So, that's been kind of preserved.
Now, we talked earlier about General Douglas MacArthur, and he basically said something to the effect of, this might get you in trouble a little bit, basically said something to the effect of that we fought the wrong enemy.
Yes.
How would you take that? How would you have taken it back then, I guess, as compared to now?
Well, he thought that, we should have fought the Japanese to an extent, but we did it right by using the Navy pretty much to island hop them. They were fighting the Chinese, and that was fortunate for us because the Chinese on land bogged the Japanese army down, and they had to commit a lot of resources. But I don't know what we fought the wrong enemy.
I guess
who do you think we should have fought?
The Russians, the communists.
Well,
I guess he could see a little bit further into the future than a lot of people, where we have today essentially a rise in Marxism.
Well, Patton had actually said that.
Am I quoting Patton instead of MacArthur? I think MacArthur said something similar too.
Well, Patton was like, MacArthur said to Kennedy, "Don't get bogged down in a land war. You'd be fighting the wrong way. Our Navy is what rules the day. And so, don't get committed to land troops. Our Navy will serve as a good deterrent regardless. And we can, he said, don't get involved in a war in Southeast Asia is basically what he said. Patton, on the other hand, he knew what the Russians were all about. And he actually wanted to join up with what was left of the German army and push the Russians back from where they had their foothold in Germany, back through Poland, back to their own border. He thought that the Russians were bad news and that we needed to nip it in the bud while we were still the only ones with the atom bomb and, had the deterrent capability. But of course, after 4 years of war, the American public was really tired of war.
I've heard that theory that like a big part of the reason, because if you watch the Oppenheimer movie that came out like a year or two ago, it talks about how, like the war was almost over, dropping the bomb on Japan was almost unnecessary. But what I've heard people kind of say, and I agree with this, is it was actually more of a deterrent effect
with the
Russians on the Russians, because they believe Stalin would have completely invaded Europe.
Well,
after
Truman,
Germany.
You were right about it. Was Patton that said that instead.
Truman, who had just assumed the presidency when Roosevelt died in April of 45, was meeting for the first time with Stalin. I think it was I always get Potsdam and Yalta mixed up, but it was whatever conference it was then. I think it was Potsdam. And he knew it was the summer of 45, and Truman had only been in office for a couple of months. And he knew we were that close with the atom bomb. And actually, when he was at the conference, they were able to tell him that the test in Los Alamos had been successful. And Truman knew this. And he said something to Stalin like, well, we've got a weapon we're going to use on Japan that's going to change everything. And he said Stalin just gave him this kind of poker face. So I don't know if Stalin already had an idea what we had vis-a-vis some of the spies that were present. But when Truman was heading back on, I think it was the USS Augusta cruiser, they let him know that the bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. And, they were able to set up a link where he told the people on the ship, and then they were able to broadcast it at sea and patch it through. And, Americans went wild and stuff. But the Russians were really nervous. I'm trying to think. I don't think they got nuclear capabilities till 1949, I believe. So for about 4 years, we were the only ones. And we probably could have used that to our advantage a lot more. It's just like a lot of people didn't know this. During the presidential campaign in 1960, Kennedy campaigned that the Republicans, growing complacent under Eisenhower and Nixon, were falling behind, and that there was the key word at the time, or key phrase, was missile gap, where the Soviets were outpacing us in missiles, and there was a missile gap against us. Well, Kennedy actually believed that, but when he assumed the presidency, he found out that there was a missile gap, but it was completely the opposite way. We were way ahead of the Soviets. And there was a 1-year period till like the spring of 62, from 61 to the spring of 62, where actually some of the more hawkish people in the Joint Chiefs even tried to get Kennedy to do this. We could have launched a preemptive strike on the Soviet Union with minimal, retribution. And some of these real warmongers tried to urge Kennedy to do that, but Kennedy wasn't having any of that. He said, no, it's just morally wrong to do this and kill people for no reason. And in fact, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was borne out that Kennedy made the right move by finding a diplomatic solution in the Bay of Pigs, because the warmongers wanted us to physically invade. We discovered afterwards that the Russians did have tactical, dirty nuclear ground weapons that they would have used had we invaded. So it would have been very, very messy, very, very quickly. So
that's fascinating.
Kennedy was very smart to do what he did. And, and we did a little bit, a lot of people don't know this, we did a little bit of tit for tat. The Russians had a legitimate gripe. We had some missiles, which by then had become obsolete, stationed in Turkey, called Jupiter missiles. And they were very close to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was like, well, you're pissed off at us having these missiles in Cuba. What about your missiles in Turkey? It's the same thing. And we were set to remove those Jupiter missiles anyway, because they had been superseded by longer range missiles, which there was no reason to have them that close. And, Kennedy, through his backdoor negotiation, said, look, we've already decided we're going to remove the Jupiter missiles. We will remove them, like I think he said, 3 months from now, quietly, but we can't go on record as saying this right now. I'm a man of my word. I'll do it, but we can't do it as a tit for tat thing, or, it'll really look weak. And Kennedy also made the pledge, and this went hand in hand with, disallowing the CIA attempts to assassinate Cuba. He said, I will pledge to you, we will never invade Cuba henceforth. So everyone was able, Khrushchev was able to save face by telling the Russians, okay, we achieved our goal by what would have been achieved by having these missiles here. They were supposed to be defensive against an American invasion. Now we have a pledge from the president that he'll never invade Cuba. So we did the right thing. Whereas Kennedy could say to the Americans, well, we told them to get their missiles the hell out of Cuba, and they got them out. So everybody won. It was a win-win situation and avoided nuclear catastrophe. In fact, it had gotten so close, they were going to bring Mrs. Kennedy and the kids to one of these real secure locations because they thought for a while it was imminent. I forget if it was the one under the Greenbrier Hotel in West Virginia. And Mrs. Kennedy said, absolutely not. She said, you know, where you go, I go with the kids. And if the American women and their children are going to be subjected to this, I'll die on the White House lawn with you, but we are not, playing that game. So she was a tough lady.
Trooper.
So we didn't end up war games.
No, thank God.
Josh, you seen that one?
No.
You've never seen War Games?
Everyone says it. Who was the guy here? Or was it Rodney?
Matthew Broderick. Wasn't it? Yeah.
I think so.
And nobody wins.
Nobody wins.
But I
got to get going.
Okay, you got to get on.
Yeah, in a minute here.
Another movie that came to mind was Hunt for Red October, I guess.
Yes.
Just a call for
Sean Connery, I think one of his last movies.
And Sam Neill.
Sam Hill? Sam Neill.
Yeah, he's more
he's
Jurassic
the actor.
Park.
Okay.
Yeah, he's in it too.
Okay.
It's based off a Tom Clancy novel.
Yeah, that
which I think is
surprise
based
me.
off real.
Yeah. Well, it
fictionalized real.
It was pretty. It was obviously fiction, but it was pretty accurate as far as the military aspects go, from what I could see.
Well, I mean, you dropped a little bit of knowledge on us, not a ton, not a lot. I mean, just 2.5 hours worth. Of
if you didn't tell me you were a teacher, I wouldn't have been able to tell.
Oh,
no, I'm messing with you. But no, definitely appreciate you coming on.
Yeah,
okay.
Wonderful
Very glad
conversation.
to come. I enjoyed it. I hope I didn't get too long-winded or anything.
No, I mean, I wasn't going to stop you. That's for sure.
Yeah, I get. Things I'm passionate about like that, I get really wound up about, and
well, you're extremely informed too. So,
and I think about what's going on in our government right now. And when, that July day when I heard about the whole William Crooks thing and Trump, and it's like having been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, I thought, oh boy, here we go again. And I think about some young people, like I get some, oh, why do I have to study this? What's this going to make what someone did 100 years ago or 50 years ago? Well, the old adage that history repeats itself, I mean, it really does. And, if we're informed about where we came from and the challenges we faced before, it'll prepare us for meeting similar challenges in the future. And I firmly believe that. And I think a lot of people just get tied up in their own little world and complacent. It's kind of like, there a lot of parallels are drawn upon getting the way our society has become. Are we similar to the last vestiges of the Roman Empire, where the average Roman only cared about the free handout of grain they were going to get that week or what was happening at the Colosseum? Have we become, we're so married to our devices and lack of responsibility. We only care about what's on YouTube coming up or what's on Netflix this weekend or, who's dating who in Hollywood or, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, but Mr. Kent, I guess we're going to close it up.
Okay.
And thank you for coming on.
All right. Thank you.
Pearl Harbor, World War II.
Yeah.
JFK files, all of it. You're obviously very, very knowledgeable. Do you have anything that you want to push, a book or anything that you have?
No, okay. I have no dog in the fight other than seeking the truth and, hoping that we continue to get good leaders. But sometimes it's hard when you see what happens to people. And again, whether you like or hate Trump, I mean, I don't think he's doing it for personal gain. I mean, he's working for free and you know, everything he's been dragged through, both legally and, you know, some of these horror stories. I mean, you know, when someone steps up and is trying to do what they think is right, okay, disagree with them on policy, fight them that way all you want, but just don't try to kill the guy, you know?
Yeah. Josh, anything before we leave?
I think it was a great show, very informative. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Anytime. All right.
Well, that'll do it for today. If anybody's stopping by, give us a like, consider subscribing, and we will we'll be on here tomorrow with Rodney.
That's right.
2:30. Thank you. Here, let's do this. Let's do it.
We see one of the first things they do is